One of the world's greatest enduring mysteries is a mystery no more. For decades, the Bermuda Triangle has captured imaginations.
On September 16, 1950, the Associated Press published an article about a series of mysterious ship and aircraft disappearances in the waters between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. This triangle-shaped region covers nearly 500,000 square miles of the Atlantic Ocean, and over the last century, nearly 100 aircraft have been lost there. In 1945, 5 Navy bombers disappeared during a routine training mission. Just 3 years later, the passenger aircraft Star Tiger disappeared without sending a distress call. Before investigators could fully explain that mystery, another passenger aircraft, a DC-3 carrying 32 people, disappeared less than an hour before reaching Miami. For decades, scientists have been trying to figure out what really happens in this place. So, in this video, we are going to explore every major scientific theory proposed to explain these mysterious disappearances and uncover what makes the Bermuda Triangle one of the most debated regions on Earth. Let's get into it. Mystery of Flight 19, 2:10 p.m., December 5, 1945. Fort Lauderdale, Florida. 5 U.S. Navy bombers roll down the runway under a clear winter sky. Nothing looks dangerous, nothing feels unusual. But this is exactly where Flight 19 begins, a routine training mission called Navigation Problem Number 1, designed to test simple dead reckoning over water. The aircraft are TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, heavy armored machines built for war. They can even float for a short time if forced down, about 90 seconds before sinking. Inside them, experienced trainees and one instructor, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, a pilot with more than 2,500 flight hours. But there is a problem no one talks about. Taylor is new to this base, unfamiliar with the Bahamas routes below him. The plan is simple. Drop practice bombs on Hens and Chickens shoals, then fly north to Grand Bahama Island, then turn back to Florida. Easy in theory. But what makes this route dangerous is the ocean below. From the sky, the Bahamas look almost identical everywhere. Shallow reefs, repeating islands, no clear landmarks if you lose direction. The bombing run goes perfectly. Direct hits, mission success. But just minutes later, something changes. A sudden winter cold front collides with the Gulf Stream in a way that wasn't fully predicted. Then comes the first strange moment. Taylor reports something no one expects. His compass is not behaving correctly. Another one fails too. And now comes the critical mistake. He believes they are over the Florida Keys, far southwest of where they actually are. But they are not near Florida at all. They are deep over the Bahamas. By around 4:30 p.m., tension inside the squadron rises. One trainee pilot, Edward Powers, realizes something is wrong. His message comes through the radio. They should turn west, not east. That is the way home. But military formation holds. Orders are followed. Taylor insists on direction changes, first east, then north, then confusion again. Every correction pulls them farther into the open ocean. At one point, a radio message cuts through, "We are entering white water." What they likely saw was not land at all, but sea foam exploding across the surface, caused by winds near 50 knots, making the ocean look like a breaking shoreline. Fuel starts dropping, anxiety rises, and Taylor's final known instruction comes in fading fragments. Keep formation tight, stay together, until fuel runs too low. Then silence begins to take over the radio. Hours later, search planes are launched. One of them, a PBM Mariner, nicknamed the Flying Gas Tank due to fuel vapor leaks, takes off to look for them, and explodes mid-air. Now, it was not just Flight 19 missing anymore. In total, 6 aircraft and 27 men were gone, with no trace left behind. What followed was one of the largest search operations the Atlantic had ever seen. And with it came the birth of a legend that would never really fade, even decades later. Birth of the Bermuda legend. It did not take long after Flight 19 for the silence over the Atlantic to turn into something much bigger. The search that followed was massive. Over 300 aircraft in the air, 21 naval vessels across the sea, Coast Guard cutters, submarines, and even hundreds of private boats joining in. At the same time, ground crews moved through the Florida Everglades on foot, checking if the planes had somehow come down inland. But what made it more strange was not just the size of the search. It was what was missing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no floating debris, not even the usual thin rainbow layer of fuel that normally spreads across the ocean after a crash. Investigators also pointed out something even more unusual. The TBM Avenger was designed to float for a short time after ditching in water. Yet, there was no sign it had ever touched the surface. Then came the official report. A 500-page Navy investigation concluded the cause was simply unknown. No further explanation, no final cause. And that single word changed everything. Because once there is no answer, people start filling the gap themselves. In the early 1950s, journalist E.V.W. Jones published reports describing strange disappearances of ships and planes between Florida and Bermuda. It was not called anything special at first, just unusual cases scattered across the ocean. Then, more than a decade later, in 1964, writer Vincent Gaddis gave it a name in a magazine story: the Bermuda Triangle. That name changed everything. Because this term became so famous that older cases were pulled back into the story, even incidents from decades earlier, like the USS Cyclops in 1918, were now linked together as if they were part of one hidden pattern. From there, attention slowly moved deeper into theories, speculation, and stories. And almost no one paused to ask what the scientists and navigation experts were actually saying. The compass that lied. Years after the disappearance of Flight 19, investigators looked back at the radio messages and flight path and noticed something important. The pilots may not have been facing an unknown force at all. They may have simply lost their sense of direction. The problem started with Lieutenant Charles Taylor. Taylor was an experienced pilot with more than 2,500 flight hours, but he was new to the Fort Lauderdale area. Before arriving there, he had spent months flying around the Florida Keys, and that detail may have played a much bigger role than anyone realized. From about 6,000 feet in the air, the Florida Keys and the islands of the Bahamas can look remarkably similar. When Taylor looked down, he became convinced he was over the Florida Keys. But he wasn't. He was actually over the Bahamas. At the same time, Taylor began reporting problems with his compasses. Investigators later believed the instruments may have suffered a mechanical failure. That single mistake changed everything. Several student pilots argued that they should simply fly west toward Florida. One pilot reportedly said that if they just headed west, they would get home. But Taylor disagreed. Instead of flying a straight course, they wandered across the Atlantic in a giant zigzag pattern, burning precious fuel with every turn. But there was another problem too, and for that, we need to understand how a compass really works. Contrary to what many people think, a compass does not point to the geographic North Pole. It points to magnetic north, a different location roughly 1,200 miles away. And the Bermuda region sits near an invisible boundary where these differences can become especially important. That might sound insignificant, but even a small error can become dangerous over long distances. A pilot thrown off by only a few degrees can drift dozens of miles from the intended route. Flying at around 150 miles per hour, without working watches to track time accurately, Flight 19 could have been pushed nearly 50 miles off course in just a couple of hours. For many researchers, the answer seemed simple: confusion, faulty instruments, and navigation mistakes. But if getting lost was enough to explain Flight 19, what about the passenger aircraft that disappeared just a few years later, after reporting no panic, no confusion, and no obvious navigation problems at all? The vanishing of Star Tiger. On January 29, 1948, a British South American Airways aircraft known as Star Tiger was making its way toward Bermuda across the Atlantic. The aircraft itself already had a troubled reputation. It was an Avro Tudor IV, a passenger plane developed from a World War II bomber design. Out of just 38 aircraft built, 7 would eventually be lost in accidents. Even before this flight, problems had already started to appear. During an earlier leg of the journey, the cabin heating system failed completely, leaving passengers freezing inside the aircraft. At 2,000 feet, there was little margin to recover from a sudden mechanical problem. And if something went wrong, there would be very little time to react. To make matters worse, the aircraft had departed heavily loaded with fuel to fight the headwinds ahead. Yet, despite all of this, nothing seemed seriously wrong. At 3:15 a.m., the crew transmitted a routine position report to Bermuda. Their navigator had even used celestial navigation, tracking the stars to confirm the aircraft's location. Whether this was fatigue, confusion, or an instrument error remains unclear. And then, only 35 minutes later, Bermuda attempted to contact the aircraft again. There was no response, no distress call, no emergency message, no warning of any kind. The Star Tiger and all 31 people on board had simply vanished. Modern investigators have proposed several possibilities. One theory suggests the aircraft's faulty heating system may have started an unnoticed fire near the fuel or hydraulic lines, which could have disabled the crew before they could even reach the radio. But there is another explanation that has fascinated researchers for decades, one involving the ocean itself and what can suddenly rise from the sea floor without warning. Methane ocean theory. To explain the disappearance of the Star Tiger, scientists pointed to something hidden deep below the surface: methane hydrates. This is not normal gas. It is often called the ice that burns. A strange solid form of methane trapped inside frozen water molecules under extreme pressure and cold. Locked safely beneath the deep ocean floor, unless something disturbs it. And right along the western edge of the Bermuda region lies a massive deposit area known as the Blake Ridge, a zone where these methane hydrates are believed to exist in large quantities under the seabed. But the danger begins if that balance breaks. The continental shelf here is not flat. It has steep underwater slopes. If even a small earthquake or underwater landslide occurs, it can suddenly release pressure from these deposits. When that happens, the hydrate doesn't slowly leak. It collapses instantly. 1 cubic meter of solid hydrate can explode into about 164 cubic meters of methane gas. That gas shoots upward in a violent chain reaction, forming massive underwater bubble plumes racing toward the surface. And when those bubbles reach the ocean, the water itself changes. It becomes fizzy, filled with gas instead of dense liquid, and a ship depends entirely on dense water to stay afloat. Remove that density, and buoyancy disappears almost instantly. In theory, a vessel could sink in seconds, leaving almost no trace behind. It sounds like a complete explanation until the problems appear, because in rapid sinking, solid wreckage does not simply disappear. Metal parts, engines, and debris should still reach the ocean floor. And yet, in many Bermuda cases, nothing was ever found. There is also another issue. Large methane releases do occur in nature, but geological records suggest they are extremely rare on human timescales, separated by thousands of years. But still, for many scientists, this remains one of the most discussed possibilities behind the disappearance of Star Tiger. And when you combine it with earlier factors like compass confusion and severe weather conditions, the Bermuda Triangle begins to look explainable. But just when it seems like the answers are starting to come together, another case appears. And unlike the previous disappearances, this one was different. In fact, in many ways, it was far more disturbing. The DC-3 signal paradox. On December 27, 1948, a DC-3 passenger aircraft landed in San Juan, Puerto Rico, after arriving from Miami. It was only scheduled for a short stop before heading back with 28 passengers and 3 crew members on board. But before departure, problems started piling up. Ground engineers discovered issues with the landing gear system. Then they found something even worse. The aircraft's battery was nearly dead and unable to properly hold a charge. He decided to rely on the aircraft's generators to recharge the system during the flight. At the same time, the radio transmitter was also having problems because of the weak battery. For a while, everything appeared normal. Then came one of the strangest communication mysteries in aviation history. At 11:23 p.m., Captain Lindquist transmitted a routine position report. The message was successfully received in Miami, nearly 700 miles away. But it was not received in San Juan, much closer to the aircraft. Later, another transmission reported that the plane was about 50 miles south of Miami and expected to land within roughly 20 minutes. This time, Miami never heard the message. Instead, it was picked up by New Orleans, more than 600 miles away. At first, it sounded impossible. But researchers later explained that under certain nighttime conditions, radio signals can bounce off the upper atmosphere and skip hundreds of miles past their intended destination. Then, the transmissions stopped. The DC-3 never arrived in Miami. One possible explanation is that the failing electrical system began affecting navigation equipment. At the same time, changing winds may have slowly pushed the aircraft off course. If that happened, a simple turn north could have carried them deep into the dark Gulf of Mexico until fuel finally ran out. And just like that, another aircraft was gone. By this point, we have seen 3 of the Bermuda Triangle's most famous disappearances. And if you notice, there is an interesting pattern. Every case seems to have a possible explanation. Yet every explanation leaves behind another question. So when all these stories are placed side by side, are they evidence of some hidden force inside the Bermuda Triangle? Or do they point toward a much simpler answer that most people have overlooked? The real answer. The Bermuda Triangle covers up to 1.5 million square miles of ocean. And over the last century, an estimated 50 to 100 aircraft have disappeared there. At first, that sounds alarming. But across 100 years, it works out to less than 1 disappearance per year. And that is where the story begins to change. Because researchers increasingly believe the Bermuda Triangle is not one great mystery, but a combination of several different dangers that can sometimes come together at the worst possible moment. The first is weather. This region sits directly in the path of some of the Atlantic's most powerful storms. Many of these systems begin near the coast of West Africa and travel thousands of miles across warm ocean water. By the time they reach the area between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, they can become extremely powerful hurricanes. And hurricanes are not the only threat. These storms can produce sudden downdrafts known as microbursts, powerful columns of air that slam downward and can force an aircraft toward the ocean within seconds. The second factor is navigation. Today, pilots have GPS and advanced tracking systems. But for much of the last century, navigation depended on compasses, radio signals, and visual landmarks. So, a small navigation mistake could become a very large one over open water. And at night, things became even worse. Over the Atlantic, the dark ocean and dark sky can blend together, making it difficult for pilots to tell what is up and what is down. This can create dangerous spatial illusions that have caused many aircraft accidents throughout aviation history. The third factor is mechanical failure. As we saw with the Star Tiger and the DC-3, disasters are often not caused by one dramatic event. They happen when several smaller problems begin stacking together: weak batteries, faulty instruments, communication failure, fuel concerns, and human mistakes. And when all of that happens over a vast ocean, the final result can look far more mysterious than it really is. So, after hearing all these explanations, what do you think? Is the Bermuda Triangle just a normal part of the Atlantic Ocean where nothing unusual exists? Or do you still feel there is something missing from the story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you liked this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you don't want to miss more incredible and real stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.